The Starlight Diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting intermittent pools of pink and blue light across the empty parking lot at 3 in the morning. Maya Chen had been working the graveyard shift for 6 months now, ever since the bills started piling up faster than her paychecks could cover them, and she'd learned that the hours between midnight and dawn belonged to a different world entirely. The regular customers who shuffled through those glass doors weren't the families and business people of daylight hours. They were the insomniacs, the addicts, the lonely souls searching for something they couldn't name, and lately, something else entirely. She'd noticed them 3 weeks ago, the ones who didn't quite move right, whose shadows seemed to fall at wrong angles under the fluorescent lights, whose eyes reflected the diner's glow with colors that didn't exist in any human spectrum. At first Maya thought exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind, but working 16-hour days between 2 jobs was finally catching up with her 24-year-old body. But then she'd seen one of them, a tall figure in an expensive suit, reach for his coffee mug, and his fingers had been just slightly too long, the joints bending in places that human anatomy simply didn't accommodate. She'd frozen behind the counter, the coffee pot trembling in her hand, but the figure had simply smiled at her with too many teeth and left a $100 bill for a $5 check. That's when Maya understood that the world was bigger and stranger than she'd ever imagined, and that understanding terrified her more than any nightmare she'd ever had. Now, as she wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that hour, her movements automatic and mindless, she watched the door with a mixture of dread and resignation. Her manager, Mr. Vex, had arrived an hour ago, and she'd learned quickly that he was one of them, whatever they were. He stood 7 feet tall, with proportions that seemed almost human until you really looked, until you noticed the way his neck was just a fraction too long, the way his fingers tapered into points that he kept carefully hidden in leather gloves, the way his eyes shimmered like oil slicks when he thought no one was watching. Mr. Vex had taken over the diner 2 months ago, and the previous manager had simply disappeared without a word, without a forwarding address, without even collecting her final paycheck. Maya had wanted to quit immediately, had drafted her resignation letter in her head 1,000 times, but she had her younger brother's medical bills to think about, had their crumbling apartment's rent due every month, had the crushing weight of responsibility that kept her chained to this fluorescent-lit purgatory no matter how wrong everything felt. The other waitress, an older woman named Dolores who'd worked at the Starlight for 15 years, had quit the day after Miss Vex arrived, and she'd looked at Maya with such pity and fear that it still haunted her dreams. Tonight the diner was unusually empty, just Maya, Mr. Vex in his office doing paperwork with that unsettling precision of his, and one customer in the corner booth. The customer had arrived just after 2, had ordered black coffee and nothing else, and had been sitting there for almost an hour without moving, without drinking, just watching. He was different from the others somehow, the strange ones who'd been trickling through late. He wore a simple dark coat and his hair was black as midnight, but there was something about his stillness that made Maya's skin prickle with awareness. His eyes, when they'd met hers briefly as she'd poured his coffee, had been ancient and golden and infinitely sad. She'd felt something shift in the air between them, like recognition, like the moment before lightning strikes, but then he'd simply nodded his thanks and she'd retreated behind her counter. Now, as the clock above the register ticked toward 3:30, Mr. Vex emerged from his office, and Maya's stomach clenched with familiar dread. He'd been in a foul mood all week, had snapped at her twice for minor infractions, had docked her pay for a broken plate that she hadn't even dropped. There was something predatory in the way he moved, something that made every instinct scream at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm, to keep wiping the counter, to pretend everything was normal. Mr. X approached her with that too smooth glide of his, and she could smell something acrid and metallic coming off him, like burning copper wires. His lips pulled back in what might have been a smile but looked more like a threat, and when he spoke his voice had that strange harmonic quality that made her teeth ache. He told her she'd been slacking, that the counter wasn't clean enough, that her uniform was wrinkled and unprofessional, that she was lucky to have this job at all considering how worthless she was. The words came faster and sharper, cutting into her with practiced cruelty, and Maya felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She'd learned not to cry in front of him, had learned that weakness only made things worse, but tonight something was different. Tonight Mr. Vex's anger seemed to feed on itself, growing larger and more volatile with each passing second. He grabbed her arm suddenly, his grip bruising even through his gloves, and yanked her toward him. His face was inches from hers now, and she could see the way his features seemed to shimmer and shift slightly, as if his human appearance was just a mask barely holding together. He told her she was nothing, that humans like her were insects beneath his notice, that she should be grateful he allowed her to serve him. The humiliation burned through Maya like acid, and she wanted to fight back, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything except stand there and take it, but fear paralyzed her completely. Then a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm and cold and carrying an authority that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The man from the corner booth was standing now, and something about him had changed, or perhaps Maya was finally seeing what had been there all along. He told Mr. Vex to release her, and though his words were quiet, they carried the weight of mountains, of ancient power barely contained. Mr. Vex released Maya's arm immediately, but not out of compliance. His whole body had gone rigid with a tension that was entirely different from his earlier aggression. When he turned to face the man from the corner booth, his expression was a mixture of disbelief and something that looked almost like fear, and Maya had never seen him afraid of anything. The stranger walked toward them with measured steps, each footfall silent despite the diner's worn linoleum floor, and as he moved the air around him seemed to ripple and distort like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. His eyes, those impossible golden eyes, were fixed on Mr. Vex, with an intensity that made Maya shiver despite not being the target of that gaze. The temperature in the diner began to drop, not dramatically, but noticeably, and Maya's breath started to mist slightly in the suddenly cold air. Mr. Vex attempted to recover his composure, drawing himself up to his full 7-foot height, and letting some of his human disguise slip away, revealing more of his true nature. His skin took on a grayish-green pallor, and his eyes darkened to solid black orbs, and when he spoke his voice carried multiple tones at once, discordant and unsettling. He demanded to know who this stranger thought he was, interrupting his business, threatening him in his own establishment. The stranger stopped about 10 feet away, and when he responded his voice was still calm, but now it carried something underneath, something that thrummed with barely restrained power. He said his name was Kai, and that he'd been watching this place for several nights now, had seen how Miss Vex treated his human employees, had seen the cruelty and abuse that happened in the dark hours when most of the city slept. Mr. Vex laughed, a horrible scraping sound that made Maya want to cover her ears, and he told Kai that humans were beneath the concern of superior beings, that they were resources to be used and discarded, that this backward planet and its primitive inhabitants existed solely for the benefit of those with the power to claim it. The words hung in the air like poison, and Maya felt sick hearing her entire species dismissed so casually, as if human life and dignity meant absolutely nothing. Kai's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of golden fire that came and went in an instant. He told Miss Vex that he'd encountered many beings across many worlds, who believed themselves superior, who justified their cruelty with claims of evolutionary or spiritual advancement, but that such beliefs never changed the fundamental truth that power without honor was just tyranny wearing a crown. Miss Vex's response was immediate and violent. He thrust out his hand and some kind of energy pulse exploded from his palm, aimed directly at Kai's chest with enough force to shatter concrete. Maya screamed or tried to, but her voice caught in her throat as she watched what happened next. The energy pulse hit Kai square in the center of his chest and simply dissipated, like water splashing against stone, and Kai hadn't even bothered to move. For a moment there was absolute silence in the diner, broken only by the eternal buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. Then Kai raised his hand palm up, and a small sphere of golden fire materialized above it, spinning slowly and casting dancing shadows across the walls. The fire wasn't hot, Maya could tell somehow, but it radiated power that made her skin tingle and her hair stand on end. Kai explained, in that same calm, measured tone, that Mr. Vex had made a critical error in judgment, had failed to recognize what he was truly dealing with. The golden fire expanded slightly and Maya saw shapes moving within it, serpentine forms coiling and uncoiling, and she understood with sudden clarity that she was witnessing something impossible, something that shouldn't exist according to every rational law of the universe she'd grown up believing in. Mr. Vex took a step backward, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a merciless sun. He stammered something in a language that hurt Maya's ears to hear, harsh consonants and twisted vowels that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. Kai responded in the same language, his pronunciation fluid and perfect, and whatever he said made Miss Vex's face contort with rage and terror in equal measure. Then Kai switched back to English, perhaps for Maya's benefit, and said that Miss Vex was a krill, a species known throughout several galaxies for their exploitation of developing worlds, for their particular fondness for establishing themselves as petty tyrants over populations that couldn't defend themselves against their advanced abilities. The krill had been doing this for thousands of years, arriving on planets that were just beginning to discover they weren't alone in the universe, infiltrating their societies, and feeding off the fear and misery they created. Miss Vex tried to interrupt, but Kai silenced him with a gesture, and the krill's mouth snapped shut as if held by invisible hands. Kai continued, saying that the krill thought themselves untouchable because they chose their targets carefully, preying only on those without the power to fight back. But they'd made a mistake coming to Earth, had failed to account for the fact that this particular planet had attracted attention from beings far older and far more powerful than themselves. He let the golden fire in his hand expand further, and now Maya could clearly see the dragon shapes moving within it, dozens of them, all coiling around each other in an intricate dance. Kai's appearance began to change subtly, scales emerging along his neck and the backs of his hands, golden and gleaming like polished metal, and his eyes brightened until they seemed to glow with their own internal light. He told Vex that he was Kai Ryodan, third son of the Dragon Emperor of the Eastern Realm, and that his people had been protecting humanity since before recorded history began, watching from the shadows, intervening when necessary to prevent extinction-level threats. The krill weren't extinction-level, they were parasites and bullies, but that didn't mean their behavior would be tolerated. Mr. Vex was shaking now, his human disguise completely abandoned, revealing his true form as something insectoid and angular, all sharp edges and chitinous play. Maya pressed herself against the counter, torn between terror and fascination, unable to look away from the confrontation unfolding before her. Mr. Vex made his decision in a split second. He would run, and his form blurred as he attempted to move faster than human eyes could track, heading for the back exit that led to the alley behind the diner. But Kai was faster, impossibly so, and he was suddenly blocking the krill's path without seeming to have moved at all. The confrontation had moved beyond words now, beyond threats and posturing, and Maya watched as Mr. Vex transformed fully into something out of a nightmare, his body expanding and elongating, extra limbs erupting from his torso, his head splitting to reveal mandibles that dripped with acidic venom. He attacked with desperate fury, all pretense of civilization stripped away, and Maya understood that she was seeing what the krill truly were, predators who'd learned to wear the skin of their prey. Kai didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, he met the attack head-on, and his own transformation accelerated dramatically. Scales spread across his skin like liquid gold, his hands became clawed and powerful, and great wings unfurled from his back. Translucent membranes stretched across delicate bone structures that nevertheless radiated immense strength. He was becoming something between human and dragon, a hybrid form that combined the best of both, and the sheer presence of it made the air itself feel heavy and charged. The diner erupted into chaos as the two beings clashed, Miss Vex striking with those terrible mandibles and multiple limbs while Kai countered with strikes that carried the force of thunderbolts. Furniture exploded into splinters, the windows shattered in cascading waves of glass, and Maya ducked behind the counter as debris flew everywhere. But even as she cowered there, even as her rational mind screamed at her to run, she couldn't help but watch through the gap in the counter, couldn't tear her eyes away from the impossible battle. What struck her most was that despite the violence, despite the destruction, Kai was holding back. His attacks were measured and controlled, designed to disable rather than kill, while Mr. Vex fought with the desperate savagery of something that knew it was outmatched. The golden flames that surrounded Kai spread throughout the diner, but they didn't burn. Instead, they seemed to pass through everything without causing harm, a supernatural fire that existed on some different plane of reality. When those flames touched the walls and floors and equipment, they revealed things, hidden devices that Mr. Vex had installed throughout the building, monitoring equipment and strange organic-looking technology that pulsed with sickly green light. Maya realized with growing horror that the entire diner had been a trap, a collection point where the krill had been gathering information about humans, studying them, perhaps selecting targets for something worse than mere humiliation. The golden flames consumed these devices, burning them to ash while leaving everything else untouched, and Maya understood that Kai wasn't just fighting Mr. Vex, he was dismantling whatever operation the krill had been running. Mr. Vex seemed to realize this too, and his attacks became more frenzied, more desperate, but desperation couldn't overcome the fundamental difference in power between them. Kai caught one of the krill's striking limbs and twisted, and there was a sickening crack that made Maya wince. Mr. Vex screamed, the sound modulating through frequencies that made her ears ring and her vision blur, and he tried to pull away, but Kai held him fast. The Dragon Prince's voice cut through the chaos, still eerily calm despite the violence, and he pronounced judgment on the krill. He said that Mr. Vex would be taken before the Council of Realms, would face justice for his crimes against humanity and countless other species across the galaxies he'd preyed upon. The krill would be stripped of his power, imprisoned in a place where he could never again harm innocents, and his network of fellow parasites would be hunted down and dealt with similarly. Mr. Vex spat something venomous, literally, a spray of acidic poison that should have melted Kai's face off, but the golden scales simply deflected it and the acid hissed harmlessly to the floor. Kai's response was to release a burst of that golden fire directly at the krill, and Mr. Vex's screams reached a new pitch as the flames engulfed him. But again, the fire didn't burn in the traditional sense. Instead, it seemed to be breaking down something fundamental, dissolving the krill's physical form but not destroying it, transforming it into pure energy that Kai then contained within a sphere of light. Within seconds, Mr. Vex was gone, trapped inside that glowing prison, and the diner fell suddenly silent except for the crackle of settling debris and Maya's ragged breathing. Kai's transformation began to reverse, the wings folding back into nothingness, the scales receding, his form compacting back into something human-shaped, though his eyes remained that brilliant gold. He turned to look at Maya, and she saw genuine concern in those ancient eyes, saw him checking to make sure she was unharmed before doing anything else. He apologized for the destruction, for frightening her, for shattering her understanding of reality so violently, his voice gentle now, almost sad. Maya tried to respond but found she couldn't form words, shock and adrenaline, and sheer disbelief all crashing over her at once. She slid down the counter to sit on the floor, her legs unable to support her anymore, and stared at the ruins of the diner around her. Everything she'd known, everything she'd believed about the world, lay in pieces around her, just like the broken furniture and shattered dishes. Kai approached slowly, carefully, as if she were a frightened animal that might bolt, and he knelt down a few feet away from her, giving her space while still being close enough to help if needed. He told her that she was safe now, that the krill was contained and would never hurt her again, that his people would ensure all of Mr. Vex's victims were protected, and that any other krill operating on Earth would be found and dealt with. Maya finally found her voice, and what came out was a single question that seemed to encompass everything she was feeling. She asked what now, what was supposed to happen to her after witnessing all this, after learning that aliens and dragons were real, and had been hiding in plain sight all along. Kai settled more comfortably on the debris-strewn floor, his posture open and non-threatening, and he began to speak in a tone that was almost conversational, as if they were old friends catching up over coffee rather than strangers who'd just witnessed an impossible battle. He told Maya that the world had always been bigger than humanity realized, that Earth had never been alone in the universe but had been protected by various factions who saw value in allowing human civilization to develop without interference. His people, the dragons, had chosen Earth as one of their protectorates tens of thousands of years ago, but walked among humans in various forms throughout history, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as warriors, always as guardians operating from the shadows. Maya listened in stunned silence as he explained that most of human mythology wasn't mythology at all but distorted memories of real events, that the stories of dragons and gods and supernatural beings were based on actual encounters that had been passed down through generations until they became legend. The dragons had largely withdrawn from direct contact with humanity around 2,000 years ago, deciding that humans needed space to develop their own culture and technology without outside influence, but they'd never stopped watching, never stopped protecting. The krill, however, were a different matter entirely. They were one of several parasitic species that hunted developing worlds, seeing them as resources to exploit, and they'd arrived on Earth about 50 years ago in small numbers, testing humanity's defenses and finding them essentially non-existent. Over the decades, more krill had arrived, establishing themselves in positions of minor power, places where they could feed on human misery without drawing too much attention, and they'd been remarkably successful at remaining hidden, because most humans simply couldn't conceive of their existence. Mr. Vex had been operating his little fiefdom here at the Starlight Diner for several months, gathering information, abusing the humans under his control, living a parasitic existence that was typical of his kind. Kai had been tracking krill activity across the city for weeks, had identified several operations like this one, and tonight he'd finally decided to intervene directly after watching Mr. Vex's cruelty reach intolerable levels. Maya processed all of this slowly, her mind struggling to accommodate concepts that would have seemed like insane conspiracy theories just hours ago, and she asked the obvious question, why tell her all this? Why reveal himself and his people when they'd supposedly been hiding for millennia? Kai's expression became thoughtful, almost melancholic, and he explained that the time for hiding was coming to an end, that humanity was approaching a critical juncture in its development, where it would either discover it wasn't alone in the universe on its own terms, or be forced into that knowledge by hostile forces. The dragons and their allies had been debating for decades about whether to reveal themselves openly, to offer humanity a place in the galactic community as partners rather than wards, but the decision kept being delayed, kept being pushed back for one reason or another. Now, however, with species like the krill becoming bolder and more numerous, with other alien factions taking interest in Earth's resources and strategic location, the time for debate was over. Within the next few years, maybe sooner, humanity would learn the truth whether the dragons liked it or not, and Kai believed it was better for that revelation to come from friends rather than enemies. Maya felt her head spinning with the implications, thinking about what this meant for everyone she knew, for her brother in his hospital bed, for the millions of people going about their lives in blissful ignorance. She asked if there were more like him, more dragons living secretly among humans, and Kai smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. He said there were dozens of his kind on Earth at any given time, some living openly as humans, some maintaining remote territories where they could assume their true forms, all of them working to keep humanity safe from threats it didn't even know existed. His father, the Dragon Emperor, oversaw these operations from the Eastern Realm, a pocket dimension that existed alongside Earth, but remained separate from it, accessible only to those with the power and knowledge to find the pathways between worlds. Kai himself had been living in this city for 3 years, working various jobs, moving through human society while monitoring for supernatural threats, and he'd grown fond of humanity despite their fragility and short lives, had come to admire their resilience and creativity. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden crackling sound, and Maya looked up to see the sphere of light containing Mr. Vex beginning to pulse with an urgent rhythm. Kai frowned and stood smoothly, moving to where the sphere hovered in midair, and he placed his hand near it without quite touching. His expression darkened as he concentrated on whatever he was sensing, and when he spoke his voice carried a note of concern that made Maya's stomach clench. He said that Mr. Vex was attempting to send a distress signal, trying to alert other krill to what had happened here, and while Kai's containment was strong enough to prevent the signal from getting through, the attempt itself suggested that there were more krill in the immediate area than he'd anticipated. The situation was more complex than a simple extraction of one rogue alien. This was potentially a full nest, a coordinated operation involving multiple krill working together. Maya felt fresh fear wash over her, asking if that meant more of them would come here, if they'd be in danger, and Kai was quick to reassure her. He said his people were already en route, that he'd signaled for backup the moment the confrontation with Mr. Vex had begun, and that within the hour this entire area would be secured by dragon operatives who'd ensure no further krill activity occurred. In the meantime, he needed to get Maya somewhere safe, somewhere the krill couldn't reach even if they tried, and he extended his hand to help her up from the floor. Maya hesitated for only a moment before taking Kai's offered hand. His grip was warm and steady, radiating a sense of security that her rational mind said shouldn't be possible, but that her instincts absolutely trusted. He helped her to her feet and kept holding her hand as he raised his other arm, fingers moving through the air in complex patterns that left trails of golden light hanging in space. The trails began to connect and expand, forming a circle that grew wider with each passing second, and within that circle reality seemed to shimmer and fold, revealing glimpses of somewhere else entirely. Maya stared at the forming portal in awe, seeing hints of a landscape that couldn't possibly exist, floating structures that defied gravity, waterfalls that flowed upward, skies that held multiple suns or moons or something in between. Kai told her this was a gateway to the Eastern Realm, to his father's domain, and that she'd be completely safe there while he and his fellow dragons dealt with the Krill situation. Maya wanted to protest, wanted to say she had responsibilities, had her job, and her apartment and her brother to think about, but even as the words formed, she realized how absurd they sounded. She'd just watched her boss reveal himself as an alien monster and get defeated by a dragon prince. Her job at the diner clearly no longer existed, and staying in her apartment would be monumentally stupid if there were more hostile aliens searching for her. As for her brother, Kai seemed to read her thoughts because he assured her that arrangements would be made, that his people would ensure her brother received the best possible care, and that she'd be able to contact him once the immediate danger had passed. The portal stabilized, becoming a perfect circle of golden light about 8 feet in diameter, and through it Maya could now see clearly into the other realm. The view took her breath away. It was a courtyard of some kind, paved with stones that seemed to be made of compressed starlight, surrounded by buildings whose architecture combined elements of traditional Asian temples with impossibly advanced technology. Gardens filled with plants she'd never seen before stretched into the distance, and figures moved among them, some humanoid, some clearly not, all going about their business with the casual familiarity of people in their native environment. Kai stepped toward the portal, gently pulling Maya along, and she took a deep breath before following him through. The sensation of crossing between worlds was indescribable, like stepping through a waterfall made of electricity, her entire body tingling as reality shifted around her. For a fraction of a second she existed in both places at once, 1 foot in the destroyed diner and 1 foot in the impossible realm, and then she was through completely and the diner was gone. The air here was different, cleaner somehow, carrying scents of flowers and incense and something else she couldn't identify, and the light had a quality unlike anything on Earth, neither quite daylight nor quite something artificial but a perfect blend of both. Maya stumbled slightly as her feet touched the starlit stone of the courtyard, and Kai steadied her with a hand on her elbow, giving her a moment to adjust and orient herself. The portal behind them remained open for a few more seconds, showing the destroyed diner like a window into another world, and then it collapsed in on itself and vanished without a sound. They were approached immediately by several figures, dragons in human form Maya assumed, though some of them weren't bothering to hide their true nature completely, showing scales on their arms or slight horns emerging from their foreheads. They spoke to Kai in rapid sequences of that melodic language she'd heard him use briefly before, their tones urgent and concerned, and Kai responded with equal intensity, occasionally gesturing back toward where the portal had been. Maya caught her name mentioned a few times and felt dozens of eyes turning to study her, not with hostility but with intense curiosity, as if she were some rare specimen they'd never encountered before. One of the dragons, a woman who appeared middle-aged with silver streaks in her black hair and eyes that shifted from gold to green, approached Maya directly and spoke in perfect English. She introduced herself as Lin, one of Kai's cousins and a healer among their people, and said that Maya must be exhausted and overwhelmed, and in need of rest and probably food. Maya realized she was indeed hungry, hadn't eaten anything since her break 6 hours ago, and the adrenaline crash was starting to hit her hard. Lin took charge with gentle authority, leading Maya away from the group while Kai continued his rapid conference with the other. They walked through the courtyard and into one of the temple-like buildings, passing through corridors whose walls seemed to shift and change subtly when Maya wasn't looking directly at them, as if the architecture itself was alive and adapted. Lin explained as they walked that the Eastern Realm existed in what humans would call a pocket dimension, a space that overlapped with Earth but remained separate, accessible through various gateways that the dragons maintained and guarded carefully. Time moved differently here, not drastically so, but enough that someone could spend days in the realm and return to Earth to find only hours had passed. The realm was home to several thousand dragons of various lineages and ages, from ancient beings who'd witnessed the birth of civilizations to young ones who'd never set foot on Earth. Lin led Maya to a spacious room that managed to be both elegant and comfortable, furnished with items that looked like they belonged in a museum but were clearly meant for daily use. There was a bed piled with soft blankets, a table set with fruit and bread and pitchers of water and wine, and large windows that looked out over gardens where the light seemed to shift through a full day's cycle every few hours. Maya sank into a chair by the table, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how much her body ached from the tension and fear of the night. Lin poured her water and encouraged her to eat something, and as Maya mechanically consumed the food, she realized she had so many questions she didn't even know where to begin. Maya had been in the Eastern Realm for what felt like 3 days, but Lin assured her had only been about 18 hours in Earth time, and in that period she'd learned more about the true nature of reality than most humans discovered in a lifetime. She'd met dozens of dragons in various forms, had toured parts of the realm that defied description, had eaten foods that tasted like memories and dreams, and had slowly begun to accept that her life would never return to what it had been. Now, however, she'd been summoned to meet the Dragon Emperor himself, Kai's father and ruler of the Eastern Realm, and the nervousness that rolled through her stomach was different from the fear she'd felt facing Mistvex, because this time she wasn't afraid of being hurt, but of being found wanting somehow. Lin had helped her prepare, providing her with clothes that were somewhere between traditional Asian formal wear and something out of a fantasy novel, elegant layers of silk in deep blues and silver that moved like water when she walked. The healer had assured her that the Emperor was kind and fair, that he'd specifically requested this meeting to thank Maya for her courage and to discuss her future, but Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to be judged by something far beyond her comprehension. The throne room was unlike anything Maya had ever seen or imagined. The space seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, walls that were there and not there, a ceiling that showed stars that weren't in any constellation she recognized, and a floor that reflected not her current form, but shadows of what she might become. At the far end of the chamber sat the Dragon Emperor on a throne that appeared to be made of solidified lightning, constantly shifting and crackling with contained power. He was in a form that was more dragon than human, scales of deepest gold covering his body, wings folded against his back, and a face that combined human and reptilian features into something majestic and terrible. Around him stood members of his court, advisors and warriors and scholars, all watching Maya with varying degrees of interest as she was escorted forward by Lin. Kai stood to his father's right, and when Maya caught his eye, he offered her an encouraging nod that steadied her nerves slightly. She walked the length of that impossible room, each step echoing strangely as if the space itself was measuring her worth, and when she reached the appropriate distance Lin had instructed her about, she stopped and attempted an awkward bow. The Dragon Emperor regarded her in silence for a long moment, his eyes ancient and deep as oceans, seeing through her in ways that made her feel transparent, and then he spoke in a voice that resonated through her entire body. He thanked her for her patience in waiting to meet him, acknowledged that she'd been thrust into circumstances no human should have to face unprepared, and expressed his admiration for how she'd conducted herself under pressure. Maya felt herself relaxing slightly as he continued, his tone formal but not cold, powerful but not threatening, and she understood why his people followed him so loyally. The Emperor explained that the situation with the krill had been more extensive than initially believed, that Kai's intervention at the diner had uncovered a network of 17 separate operations across the city, all of them now dismantled and their operators contained. The information gathered from these sites had revealed that the krill had been on Earth far longer than the dragons had known, had established themselves in dozens of cities worldwide, and were planning something larger than simple parasitic exploitation. The details were still being analyzed, but it appeared the krill had been preparing for a full-scale infiltration, potentially working with other hostile species to establish a permanent foothold on Earth. This revelation had forced the Emperor's hand regarding the dragon's long-standing policy of remaining hidden from humanity, and he'd made the decision that morning to begin the process of formal contact with Earth's governments and people. Maya listened in growing amazement as the Emperor outlined plans for gradual revelation, starting with discreet contacts to specific leaders and institutions, building toward a public announcement within the next year that would forever change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. He said that humans like Maya, who'd already been exposed to the truth through unfortunate circumstances, would be crucial in helping humanity adjust to this new reality, serving as bridges between the human and supernatural world. The Emperor then said something that shocked Maya to her core. He was offering her a position within his court, a role as a liaison and advisor on human affairs, with full training in the arts and sciences of the dragons, access to knowledge and power that most humans would never dream of. She would be compensated generously. Her brother would receive the best medical care available, including treatments that didn't exist in conventional human medicine, and she would have the opportunity to help shape how first contact between dragons and humanity proceeded. Maya's mind reeled, unable to process the magnitude of what was being offered. This was so far beyond anything she'd ever imagined for her life that it seemed like a dream or hallucination. She stammered something about not being qualified, about being just a waitress with barely any college education, about having no idea how to advise beings that had existed for millennia. The Emperor's response was patient and kind. He said that her perspective was precisely what made her valuable, that the dragons had spent so long living apart from humanity, that they sometimes forgot what it meant to be human, to struggle with the daily challenges of mortal existence, to see the world through eyes unclouded by centuries of experience. Maya's understanding of human resilience, her first-hand knowledge of how ordinary people lived and thought, her ability to survive and maintain her compassion despite hardship, these were the qualifications that mattered. The court around them murmured in what sounded like agreement, and Kai stepped forward to add his own endorsement, saying he'd watched Maya handle an impossible situation with remarkable courage, that she'd kept her head when confronted with world-shattering revelation, that she possessed exactly the kind of character the dragons needed in their human liaison. Maya felt tears threatening to fall but held them back, overwhelmed by the faith these powerful beings were placing in her, by the opportunity being offered, by the sheer impossibility of everything that had happened. She asked for time to think, to process, to make sure she was making this decision with a clear head, rather than in the aftermath of trauma and shock. The Emperor granted her request immediately, saying she could have as much time as she needed, that the offer would remain open, and that regardless of her decision she would be protected and provided for. He dismissed the court then, the formal audience over, but gestured for Maya and Kai to remain as the others filed out of the throne room in a orderly procession. Once the throne room had emptied except for the three of them, the Dragon Emperor's form began to shift, becoming more human, less overwhelming, until he appeared as a distinguished man in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and those same penetrating golden eyes that Kai had inherited. He stepped down from his throne and approached Maya with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his earlier majesty, and he invited her to walk with him and Kai through the palace gardens where they could speak more informally. Maya agreed, grateful for the change in atmosphere, and soon they were strolling along paths lined with flowers that chimed softly when the wind touched them, past fountains whose water flowed in impossible spirals, under trees whose leaves seemed to whisper secrets in languages older than human civilization. The Emperor insisted she call him Shen, spoke about his own experiences with humans throughout history, about the individuals who'd impressed him over the millennia, about his belief that humanity had the potential to become one of the great civilizations of the cosmos, if given the chance to develop properly. He'd watched human cultures rise and fall, had seen periods of remarkable enlightenment and devastating darkness, and through it all he'd maintained his faith that humans were worth protecting and nurturing. Shen acknowledged that his decision to offer Maya this position wasn't entirely altruistic, that the dragons desperately needed people who could help them understand modern humanity, who could warn them when their ancient perspectives were leading them astray, who could serve as reality checks when thousand-year-old beings started losing touch with mortal concerns. Maya would be challenging them constantly, questioning their assumptions, forcing them to see things through human eyes, and while that might sometimes be uncomfortable, it was absolutely necessary. Kai added that he'd been advocating for more direct human integration into dragon affairs for years, that he'd argued repeatedly that secrecy was becoming unsustainable and that proactive contact would be better than reactive crisis management, and that Maya's arrival had given those arguments new weight and urgency. Maya listened to both of them, heard the sincerity in their voices, saw the genuine respect in their eyes, and slowly the impossible began to feel possible. She asked practical questions about what her life would look like, about whether she'd be able to maintain connections to her human friends and family, about what kind of training she'd receive, about the dangers she might face. Shen answered each question thoroughly, explaining that she'd split her time between the Eastern Realm and Earth, that she'd be trained in dragon history and culture, as well as basic supernatural abilities that any human could learn with proper instruction, that yes, there would be risks, but she'd be protected by some of the most powerful beings in existence, and that her connections to human life would be maintained and even strengthened, because those connections were what made her valuable. They reached a pavilion overlooking a valley, where young dragons were training, practicing aerial maneuvers in forms that ranged from fully draconic to barely distinguishable from human, and Maya watched in awe as they dove and soared and breathed controlled bursts of various colored flame. Shen said that one day, if she accepted this position and committed to the training, she might be able to do similar things, that humans had latent potential that could be awakened with the right technique, that the separation between human and supernatural wasn't as absolute as most people believe. The idea that she might someday fly, might command elements, might live for centuries with proper training, seemed like fantasy, but she'd already witnessed so many impossible things that she couldn't dismiss it outright. Maya thought about her life about the endless grind of minimum wage jobs, about the constant stress of bills and responsibilities, about the slow suffocation of dreams deferred indefinitely, and she realized that even if the old life had still been available to her, she wouldn't want to return to. She thought about her brother, about how he'd been suffering with his illness for 3 years while human medicine proved inadequate, about how the treatments Shen was offering might actually save him, might give him a chance at a normal life. She thought about the bigger picture, about humanity standing on the edge of first contact with the wider cosmos, about how that contact could go wonderfully or disastrously depending on how it was handled, about the responsibility of being one of the people who could influence that outcome. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, but it wasn't paralyzing, it was clarifying, like everything in her life had been leading to this exact moment. Maya took a deep breath of that strange, perfect air and turned to face Shen and Kai, and she could see in their expressions that they already knew what she was going to say but were waiting patiently for her to voice it. She said yes, she would accept the position, would become a liaison between dragons and humans, would dedicate herself to helping manage first contact and building bridges between worlds, would embrace this impossible opportunity with everything she had. The relief and joy that crossed both their faces was immediate and genuine, and Kai actually hugged her impulsively before remembering himself and stepping back with an embarrassed apology. Shen smiled warmly and clasped her hands in his, and he told her she'd made a brave choice, the right choice, and that he was confident she would exceed even his highest expectation. He said her training would begin immediately, but gently, that she'd be given time to adjust and learn at her own pace, that Lin would serve as her primary mentor while Kai would handle her education in field operations and Earthside protocols. Maya felt something shift inside her, a sense of purpose and direction that had been missing from her life for as long as she could remember, and she understood that she wasn't just accepting a job but embracing a complete transformation of her identity and destiny. The scared, exhausted waitress who'd cowered behind a diner counter was still part of her, would always be part of her, but now she was also something more, something that was just beginning to emerge. 3 months had passed in the Eastern Realm, which translated to about 3 weeks on Earth, and Maya barely recognized herself anymore when she caught her reflection in the crystalline mirrors that lined the training halls. She was stronger, more confident, moved with a grace that came from daily practice in combat forms that were thousands of years old, and her eyes had developed a slight golden tint that Lin assured her was temporary but might become permanent if she continued advancing in her studies. The training had been intense but never cruel, pushing her to her limits while respecting her very human need for rest and recovery, and she'd discovered capabilities within herself that she'd never suspected existed. This morning she was working with Kai on elemental manipulation, specifically trying to manifest and control fire, which was apparently the most fundamental skill for anyone connected to dragon magic. They stood in a courtyard where the stone floor was inscribed with protective sigils that would contain any accidental outbursts, and Kai demonstrated for the 100th time how to draw energy from her core, channel it through her meridians, and express it as flame. He made it look effortless, a small sphere of golden fire appearing above his palm and dancing through intricate patterns as he manipulated it with subtle gestures, But when Maya attempted the same thing, she managed only a few sparks that fizzled out. Immediate frustration bubbled up inside her, the same frustration she'd been battling for weeks as she struggled with concepts that seemed to come naturally to beings raised in this world, and Kai sensed it immediately. He dismissed his flame and moved closer, his voice taking on that patient, instructive tone she'd come to appreciate, reminding her that she was trying to learn in months what most dragons spent decades mastering, that her progress was actually remarkable for a human, that the fact she could generate sparks at all meant she had genuine talent. Maya took a deep breath and tried again, focusing on the visualization exercises Lin had taught her, imagining a flame at her center burning with purpose and will, drawing that flame upward through channels she could almost feel now, bringing it to her palm and commanding it to manifest. This time she got more than sparks. A small flickering flame appeared above her hand and held for nearly 5 seconds before guttering out, and the triumph she felt was disproportionate to the achievement but entirely genuine. Kai whooped and congratulated her, saying that was the breakthrough they'd been working toward, that now it was just a matter of practice and repetition until the action became second nature. The rest of the training session went better, and by the end Maya could reliably produce small flames that lasted for 10 or 15 seconds, could make them grow slightly brighter or dimmer with concentration, and could move them between her hands with careful focus. It was exhausting work that left her drained and shaking, but the sense of accomplishment made every moment of effort worthwhile. After training, Maya had her daily session with Lin, who was teaching her about the hidden history of human-dragon interaction, about the individuals throughout history who'd been brought into the secret, about the various ways those revelations had gone well or poorly. Lin showed her records kept in archives that existed partly as physical documents and partly as crystallized memories that could be experienced directly, and Maya lived through moments of ancient history as if she'd been present for them. She witnessed a Chinese emperor being advised by dragons during a critical military campaign, saw medieval European peasants being saved from a plague by dragon intervention that was later attributed to divine miracle, experienced the perspective of a Polynesian navigator being guided across impossible ocean distances by dragon-influenced currents and winds. These experiences gave Maya context for her own role, helped her understand that what she was doing wasn't unprecedented but was certainly rare and important, and showed her both the potential and the pitfalls of human supernatural cooperation. She also spent time with her brother, who'd been brought to the Eastern Realm for treatment 3 days after her arrival, and who was responding remarkably well to dragon medicine. His illness, which human doctors had said was incurable and degenerative, turned out to be caused by exposure to residual krill energy from a device they'd installed near his apartment building, and once that energy was cleansed from his system, his body had begun healing itself with the help of dragon-enhanced therapies. He'd been shocked by everything Maya had revealed but had adapted quickly, his natural curiosity overcoming his disbelief, and now he spent his days exploring the realm and asking endless questions of anyone patient enough to answer. Seeing him healthy and happy, and full of energy again, made every challenge Maya faced completely worthwhile. In the evenings, Maya often sat with Kai on a balcony overlooking the realm's capital city, watching the lights come on as the artificial day cycle shifted toward night, and they'd talk about everything and nothing, sharing stories about their vastly different lives and finding unexpected common ground. Kai told her about the pressure of being a prince, about the expectations that came with his bloodline, about his desire to make meaningful changes in how dragons interacted with the cosmos. Maya shared her experiences of poverty and struggle, about the dreams she'd had to abandon, about the people she'd known who'd been crushed by circumstances beyond their control. They discovered they both loved music, though Kai's preferences ran toward traditional instruments that hadn't been played on Earth in centuries, while Maya favored contemporary pop and rock, and they'd spend hours debating the merits of different artistic approaches. There was something developing between them. Maya could feel it in the way their conversations grew deeper and more personal, in the way Kai looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, in the warmth that spread through her chest when he smiled. She wasn't sure what to do about these feelings, wasn't sure if it was appropriate or wise to develop romantic interest in a dragon prince who was technically thousands of years old, even if he appeared to be in his early 30s, but she also wasn't sure she could stop the feelings, even if she wanted to. Tonight, as they sat together watching the stars, which were different from Earth's stars and somehow more vibrant, Kai turned to her with an expression of unusual seriousness, and said he had something to tell. Maya's heart started beating faster, as she saw the vulnerability in Kai's expression, a openness she'd never witnessed from him before, despite their growing friendship, and she gave him her full attention, waiting for whatever revelation was coming. Kai started speaking slowly, choosing his words carefully, and he said that he needed to be honest with her about something he'd been keeping to himself for the past several weeks, something that might complicate their working relationship, but that he couldn't continue hiding without feeling dishonest. He explained that from the moment he'd first seen her in the diner, even before the confrontation with Mr. Vex, he'd felt something unusual, a pull or connection that didn't fit any of his previous experiences, and at first he'd dismissed it as simple attraction, or perhaps a premonition about the role she'd come to play. But as he'd gotten to know her over these past months, as he'd watched her tackle impossible challenges with determination and grace, as he'd spent countless hours talking with her, and training her, and simply being near her, that connection had deepened into something he couldn't deny or ignore anymore. Kai said he was falling in love with her, might have already fallen completely, and he knew this created complications because he was her mentor, and technically her superior in the dragon hierarchy, and also he was basically immortal, while she was human, and that imbalance was potentially problematic. But he couldn't keep pretending he felt otherwise, just to maintain professional distance. The confession hung in the air between them, and Maya felt a dozen different emotions crashing through her simultaneously: surprise even though part of her had suspected, joy because she felt the same way, fear about all the complications he'd mentioned, and overwhelming warmth that someone as extraordinary as Kai could look at ordinary her and see something worth loving. She reached out and took his hand, and the contact sent that familiar tingle of energy through her that she'd learned to recognize as the resonance between their compatible magical signatures. Maya told him she'd been feeling the same thing, had been trying to convince herself it was just gratitude or admiration, or the natural bonding that came from intense shared experiences, but she knew it was more than that, had known it for weeks now. She loved him too, loved his patience and kindness, loved the way he balanced ancient wisdom with genuine curiosity about the world, loved how he made her feel both protected and empowered, loved the person she was becoming with his guidance and support. The concerns he'd raised about immortality and power dynamics were valid, but they weren't insurmountable, and she'd rather face those challenges with him than spend her life wondering what might have been if they'd both been too scared to take the risk. Kai's face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness, and he pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home, despite being in a realm so far from anything she'd known before. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other under alien stars, and then Kai pulled back just enough to kiss her, gentle at first but quickly deepening, as months of suppressed feeling found expression. Maya had been kissed before, but never like this, never with the sense that she was connecting to something vast and eternal, never with power crackling at the edges of the contact making the air around them shimmer and spark. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Kai was laughing with pure delight, and small wisps of golden flame were dancing around his shoulders without him seeming to notice or care. He told her they'd need to tell his father that relationships between dragons and humans weren't forbidden but were rare enough to merit formal acknowledgement, and that there would be protocols to follow and probably some teasing from his siblings and cousins. Maya said she could handle that, could handle whatever came next as long as they were facing it together, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. The conversation shifted then to practical matters, about how they'd navigate their dual roles as colleagues and romantic partner, about setting boundaries so their personal relationship didn't interfere with her training and development, about the long-term implications given their different lifespans, and the potential solutions that existed for that particular problem. Kai explained that there were ways for humans to extend their lifespans dramatically if they fully embraced dragon magic, that some of the humans who'd been brought into the secret centuries ago were still alive and thriving, but that such transformations required commitment and couldn't be undertaken lightly. Maya filed that information away for future consideration, knowing it was too early in their relationship to be making decisions about magical life extension, but relieved to know the option existed if they eventually decided they wanted centuries together instead of just decades. They talked late into the night, making plans and sharing hopes and simply enjoying the newfound freedom of being honest about their feelings, and by the time they reluctantly parted to get some sleep before morning training, Maya felt like she was floating. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's conversation in her mind, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in just 3 months. She'd gone from a struggling waitress trapped in a dead-end existence to a dragon liaison with magical abilities falling in love with an immortal prince, and while the rational part of her mind insisted this couldn't be real, the rest of her knew, with absolute certainty, that this was the most real thing she'd ever experienced. The next morning at breakfast, Lynn took one look at Maya's face, and immediately knew something had changed, and when Maya shyly confirmed that she and Kai were together now, the healer's response was a knowing smile, and a comment that everyone had been waiting for them to figure out what was obvious to all observers. Apparently the entire court had noticed the way they looked at each other, had been running betting pools on when they'd finally acknowledged their feelings, and Lynn herself had won a substantial amount by correctly predicting it would happen before Maya completed her 4th month of training. Maya felt herself blushing but couldn't bring herself to be embarrassed, not when everything felt so right, and when Kai arrived at the training courtyard that morning, wearing an expression of such contentment that several of the other students asked if he'd achieved some new level of enlightenment, she had to suppress a laugh. 6 months after Maya's arrival in the Eastern Realm, which translated to approximately 2 months of Earth time, due to the temporal differences between dimensions, the moment that would reshape human history finally arrived, and Maya stood at the center of it all, feeling equal parts terrified and exhilarated. The Dragon Emperor had decided that the time for secrecy had ended, that humanity needed to know the truth before hostile forces made that revelation in ways designed to cause maximum chaos and fear, and he'd chosen to make first contact through official channels with the world's major governments simultaneously. Maya's role was crucial, because she'd proven capable of translating not just language but cultural context between dragons and humans, helping each side understand the other's perspectives, and avoiding the catastrophic misunderstandings that could doom the whole endeavor. The location chosen for the initial contact was a secure United Nations facility in Geneva, selected because it represented international cooperation, and because its security could be enhanced by dragon magic to prevent any interference from hostile supernatural entities or human extremists. Representatives from 20 major nations had been invited under conditions of absolute secrecy, told only that they were about to witness something that would require immediate policy decisions and international coordination. Maya had helped draft the presentation that would introduce dragons to human leadership, had worked with Shen and his advisors to strike the right balance between demonstrating power and expressing peaceful intent, between providing enough information to establish credibility and holding back details that humanity wasn't ready to process. Now, as she stood in the conference room wearing formal attire that blended human and dragon aesthetic sensibilities, watching world leaders file in with expressions ranging from curiosity to irritation to suspicion, she felt the weight of what was about to happen settling on her shoulders. Kai stood beside her in an elegant suit that concealed his true nature, and when he noticed her hands trembling slightly, he discreetly took one and squeezed it reassuringly. Shen was waiting in an adjacent room along with a dozen other high-ranking dragons preparing to make an entrance that would be memorable but not threatening, and the plan was for Maya to provide the initial introduction before the Emperor revealed himself and his people. The UN Secretary-General called the meeting to order, looking puzzled but professional, and thanked everyone for attending on such short notice for a matter of grave international import. Then she turned the floor over to Maya, who stepped forward with her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, and began to speak. She introduced herself simply, giving her name and background as a normal human who'd stumbled into extraordinary circumstances, establishing her relatability before dropping the impossible truth on them. Maya explained that humanity was not alone in the universe, had never been alone, and that Earth had been under the protection of an ancient civilization for thousands of years. She acknowledged that this sounded like science fiction or delusion, but asked them to reserve judgment until they'd seen the evidence that was about to be presented. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs and a few demands for explanation, but Maya pressed on, describing the dragons in broad terms, explaining their role as guardians and their decision to finally reveal themselves in light of increasing threats from hostile alien species. She talked about the krill and other parasitic entities that had been infiltrating Earth, about the networks that had been dismantled, about the larger galactic community that humanity was about to be introduced to, whether they were ready or not. Some of the assembled leaders looked intrigued, others openly scoffing, and a few seemed genuinely frightened by the implications, and Maya could see the moment where she lost some of them, where the concepts became too large and strange for immediate acceptance. That's when Shen made his entrance, and the dragon's dramatic flair for perfect timing proved its worth. The emperor walked through the doors in human form, distinguished and dignified, flanked by his honor guard, and as every eye turned to him he allowed his true nature to show through, scales rippling across his skin, eyes blazing with golden light, an aura of power that made the air itself feel charged. The room fell absolutely silent as the gathered humans stared at something their rational minds insisted couldn't exist, and then Shen began to transform fully, his body expanding and shifting until a dragon stood before them, majestic and terrible and undeniable. The reaction was immediate and varied. Several leaders jumped from their seats, security personnel reached for weapons they'd been required to leave outside, someone screamed, but no one could look away. Shen held his dragon form for perhaps 30 seconds, letting them absorb the reality of his existence, and then smoothly transformed back to human appearance, and began to speak. His voice carried that harmonic quality that made every word feel significant. He addressed them with respect and authority in equal measure, acknowledging the shock they must be feeling, understanding their skepticism and fear, but asking them to move past those initial reactions to consider what this revelation meant for humanity's future. Shen explained that dragons had been humanity's secret protectors since the earliest days of civilization, had intervened countless times to prevent extinction events, had shared knowledge subtly through individuals they'd contacted throughout history, and had made the difficult choice to remain hidden because premature revelation might have stunted humanity's development. But circumstances had changed. Hostile forces were increasing their activities on Earth, and continuing to hide would only leave humanity more vulnerable when inevitable contact with malevolent aliens occurred. The Emperor offered partnership, shared defense, gradual integration into the galactic community under dragon guidance and protection, access to advanced knowledge and technology that could solve many of humanity's most pressing problems. In exchange, he asked only for cooperation, for trust that would have to be earned through transparent action, and for humanity to accept that it was no longer the dominant intelligence on its own planet. The speech lasted 20 minutes and hit every point Maya and the advisory team had carefully crafted, and when Shen finished there was another moment of stunned silence before the questions began flooding in. Rapid-fire inquiries about proof and intentions and implications that Maya spent the next 3 hours helping to address. By the end of that first meeting, nothing had been decided officially, but everything had changed fundamentally, and Maya knew that within days the secret would spread despite all security measures, that within weeks humanity would be reeling from the revelation, that within months the world would be completely transformed. As they left the facility through secure exits that led directly back to portal gateways, Kai put his arm around her shoulders and told her she'd been magnificent, that her ability to speak to humans in terms they could understand while representing dragon interests fairly had been exactly what the situation needed. Maya leaned into him, exhausted but satisfied, knowing that this was just the beginning, that the real work of building bridges between species and managing humanity's integration into the wider cosmos was still ahead. But she also knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and that knowledge gave her strength for whatever challenges lay ahead. The frightened waitress who'd once cowered before a petty alien tyrant was gone, replaced by someone who'd faced her fears and emerged transformed, someone who'd found love and purpose in the most impossible circumstances, someone who would help guide humanity through the greatest transition in its history. Maya Chen, dragon liaison and bridge between worlds, smiled as they stepped through the portal back to the Eastern Realm, ready for whatever came next.